Hello beautiful people! Welcome to Bree Talks Books. I'm Bree, and you already know I'm here to talk about books. So let's go! In today's video, I'm going to be wrapping up all the books that I read in August and September. So this is coming kind of late. I actually already filmed my August wrap up, but due to technological difficulties, I lost the footage to that. So I'm filming it again here and now. If you don't know, I have been on a bit of an hiatus, but I'm glad to be back. School started, I'm a teacher, so I'm teaching virtually right now, getting into the swing of things now that we've kind of been doing this for over a month now. So I'm happy to be back on my booktube channel. There's a lot of books that I've read though between now and then and while I was gone and before and after, all of that. So I'm just starting here today with the August and September reads that I have not talked about yet. So in that time I actually read 8 books and today I'm going to be talking about 7 of them. The 8th one was Get a Life Chloe Brown, and I actually have a standalone review already. I will link that down below. Go check it out if you are interested. And with that, I'm just gonna get into the books, and as far as the order that I'm going to talk about the books in, I'm gonna go from my least favorite to my most favorite reads over like that 2-month period or whatever. The first book that I'm going to talk about is The Bone Witch by Chupeco. So this book I actually gave 2 stars, and I don't give 2 stars often, but honestly it was just a little bit difficult to follow. This is a YA fantasy and it follows T, she's the main character, and at the beginning of the novel she accidentally has risen her brother from the dead, and this is her first experience with necromancy, so she didn't know that she had this power or whatever. She's from a family of witches, but necromancy is seen as like dark and evil, so she is kind of ostracized and outcast because of that, and she ends up being taken in by a elder witch who is also what they consider the necromancer witches are bone witches, hence the title. So she is taken to this like far off land where she is to train with other bone witches, and she is aspiring to be an Asha, and Ashas use elemental magic, so they are like redeemed very highly and well respected and whatnot, and that's what she wants to be. And the beginning of the story started off really strong. I was really enjoying the different magic elements, learning about that, and as we kind of got to know different characters and things, it was really interesting. But then it kind of got difficult to follow. Like there was a random prince, but I think there was more than one prince, and she was with these like other witches that she was training with, and like they didn't like her, but then there was like somebody who was secretly like infiltrating them. It just seemed like a lot of information was thrown at us and it wasn't all necessarily connected to the plot, and I couldn't tell if this was like the style that the story was written, because I wasn't sure if it was like just the audiobook format was confusing and I needed to like read it physically, because that definitely happens with some books, but it seems like there were just a lot of loose ends that weren't connected. And I know that this is a trilogy, so the series continues on and maybe those things tie together, but I just wasn't that connected with the story, so I gave it 2 stars and I'm moving on. The next book I'm going to share was also a YA fantasy, and that was Ace of Shades by Amanda Foody. So this book I downloaded because I had a free credit on my Audible account. I had heard a little bit about it, so I wanted to check it out, and I figured why not? So this story follows N, and she's traveling to the city of Sin to find her adopted mother. She was raised really proper and high class, so this like basically like a Vegas type of city that she is now trying to survive in is very much out of her element, and the only lead that she has to go on is that she has to find a guy named Levi in order to hopefully help her find her mother. And she's expecting a gentleman, and that is not what Levi is at all. He's actually like a street rat running like the casino, the illegal street gangs, and all of that. So Anne kind of has to go to his world in order to be able to find her mother and save the people that she cares about. So this is definitely an urban fantasy. It's like grungy. There's like casinos and cabarets, mafias, lots of gangs, violence, all of that, and she's just trying to survive so that she can go home. This was like a really fun story. It definitely follows that classic YA style. So parts of it were predictable, but I definitely still enjoyed it. Overall, I gave it 3 stars, and this one is also a trilogy, and this is one that in the future I could actually see myself getting back into the series and reading the next books. We'll just kind of see how it goes with my massive TBR. But overall, I thought it was really solid. I enjoyed it. So the next book I read was Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is a YA thriller, and it's heavily inspired by the R. Kelly stories. Lots of trigger warnings warnings, so definitely be aware of those before reading. It is very heavily inspired by like the true stories of the victims, so just know that before going into it. The beginning of the story starts with the crime scene, and then we go back in time to like the events that led up to that event. So at the beginning, we meet Enchanted Jones, and she is a senior in high school, and she's an aspiring singer. She's covered in blood, has no memory of what happened the night before, and is the #1 suspect for this killing. Then we go back in time a few months before, where she's in high school and is doing this singing competition because she really wants to get a record label. Her parents definitely want her to focus more on school, getting good grades, and going to college. They love that she, you know, likes to sing and everything, but they want her to really focus on something that is more reliable. She's the oldest in her family and has younger siblings, and she's really tired of being stuck at home babysitting. She definitely rebels against her parents, tries to go out and pursue her dreams on her own. She ends up meeting Corey, who is already a famous R&B singer, and he kind of takes her under his wing as a mentor, and then based on the news you can probably figure out how that actually goes. This story was definitely really difficult to read. There's a lot of decisions that are made within the book by multiple characters that are very frustrating. The audiobook is narrated very well, and she really brings like the characters to life in that sense. It makes them very real. So even though like the story was predictable in one way, it definitely still has those thriller elements. And I definitely thought it was a really good book because it definitely addresses difficult topics such as victim blaming and the signs of predators. I think it's a story that's definitely worth reading. It's heavy, it's difficult, but it was a pretty short book. I think it was definitely very powerful. Overall, I gave this book 4 stars. Like I said, I thought it was written extremely well. Given the content matter, it's not a fun read, but it's definitely thought-provoking, and I definitely think for teenagers, it definitely spreads awareness and teaches some valuable lessons. The 4th book I'm going to talk about is Queen of Air and Darkness by Cassandra Clare. This is the 3rd book in the Dark Artifices series, which is, or it's a trilogy, so it's the final book in that, and this is one of the many Shadowhunter books. If you aren't aware, Cassandra Clare writes YA fantasy. They're all in the same universe. So there's the Mortal Instruments series, which is the first one. There's 6 books in that one, set in New York, following those Shadowhunters. And then the 2nd trilogy follows the Shadowhunters in London in like the late 1800s. So that one's pretty cool. And then in the Dark Artifices, it's present day and in LA. So there's definitely crossovers with characters and things like that. So it is recommended that you read the previous books. There's also short story collections in between those. I haven't read any of the short stories, so I don't feel like I'm missing anything, but other people swear that you need to read them first. I don't think you do. And honestly, I think Cassandra Clare does a really good job at like setting up the series so that you don't really need to read all of them if you don't want to. You can just start with like the new one, and the world and everything, the magic system is like explained every time, so you'll get accustomed to it. There will just be characters that you might not know all of their history. That's just a personal preference on if you care about that or not. I know for the newest trilogy, for Chain of Gold, that's the first one in that one, that is a direct continuation of Infernal Devices, so probably don't want to read that one without reading the Infernal Devices first. But anyway, let me just try and summarize this without spoiling it, seeing that I'm like 12 books deep into these Shadowhunter books now. So, like I said, Queen of Air and Darkness takes place in LA. It's following Emma and Julian. They are a pair of a time, and they are shadow hunters. So they're fighting demons. They are raised, so they're fighting demons. They live together in the institution along with the rest of the Blackthorn family, and they're raised to fight demons and like downworlders. So all the different monsters you can think of and the fantasy creatures and everything, they all take place within this series. So it's like a big world, huge scope, and because it's the 3rd book in the series, of course, there's like, we're on the brink of some type of civil war, because if you're not familiar, Cassandra Clare books kind of follow a general formula, and it's always like, you know, a twist with it, but it's definitely a general formula. There's some type of evil dark magic, and the main characters always have to team up together to defeat it, and there's this idea that downworlders are evil, so those are like the fae, vampires, werewolves, all of them. They're seen as evil, and the Shadowhunters are kind of divided on whether they want to help them or see them as criminals and want to get rid of them. So that's a thing. There's also, in this one, there's a curse that they're trying to break. They travel to fairy in this one, so that's cool to see. Basically, the strengths of this book are the characters. I really like especially like the side character stories, and particularly like a lot of the siblings in this one. It's just precious. I love it. There's a lot of really good representation as well. A few of the siblings are queer, as well as one of the siblings is autistic. So that's really interesting to see, and I think definitely adds like more layers to the story. I think that's all I can really say without giving other stuff away. There's necromancy as well in this one. And there's trigger warnings too, so make sure you look those up before reading them. In particular, this one does deal with a lot of grief in it. I definitely thought that was handled really well. I cried the whole time. And overall, I gave this book 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed it. The last 3 books I have to talk about, I gave all of them 5 stars. So first we have The Librarian of Auschwitz by Antonio Iturbe. This actually was a reread for me. I read the physical book over the summer while I was doing curriculum writing, because it's a book that I'm going to be teaching this year. If you don't know, I teach 8th grade ELA, so it was a book that I had to read for work, but I chose to read it, and I chose to read it again. I absolutely love this book. It's a beautiful story. It takes place obviously during World War II. It's a historical fiction, but it definitely is inspired by a true story, and in the author's notes in the back there is an interview with the main character of the story. So I definitely recommend reading that part as well, because it gives a lot of insights to events that happened in the book. It was really fascinating. Also, this book is a translation from the original. So this follows the story of Dita Kraus. She's a 14-year-old girl living in the Terezín ghetto in Prague during World War II, and she is the librarian of Auschwitz. She is responsible for 8 books that were smuggled into the camp, and she carries them around in her pockets and circulates them amongst different resistance members within the camp. That's like the short version of the story. Obviously, this story has a lot of trigger warnings, deals with some really heavy topics, so make sure that you're familiar with those if that's something that you're sensitive to before going in. I think that it's a really good depiction, historically accurate depiction of what happened. And even though it's a young adult book, it definitely is a true depiction of the horrific events that took place. There was part of the author's note that I thought was really powerful, where he talked about how sometimes fiction does a better job at telling the real story than true stories do. There's an event that happens in the novel that's very controversial, and in real life the actual person that it's about is written wrong in history. Like the way that he's depicted in history is inaccurate, and they're like not allowed to talk about it. So that's why the author chose to make this a historical fiction, because he definitely talks about what really happened. So that was definitely a really interesting perspective, and you have to read the author's notes to know that, so always read those. So as I said, it follows Dita's journey and her experience as a prisoner, and even though it's a story that's full of grief and sadness and loss, there's definitely still hope at the end of it, and I just think that it is beautiful. It's just a beautiful story, beautifully written. I can't recommend it enough. You should absolutely read it, especially if you like historical fiction. It's very good. The next 5-star read that I read was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is a Chinese-inspired adult fantasy, and there's lots of trigger warnings for this as well. It's very, very dark, and it is heavily, heavily influenced by the rape of the Nanking. So if you're familiar with that history, know that before going in. Trigger warnings for violence, rape, all of the above, drug abuse, all of that. So be aware, it's dark, it's real, there's war. With that being said though, it was epic, and I cannot wait to continue on with the rest of the series. The 3rd and final book comes out in November, so I'm excited to read the 2nd one and dive right into the 3rd one. So The Poppy War follows Rin, and she's a peasant from a peasant town. She's adopted, and she ends up passing. So the story follows Rin. She's a peasant and she's an orphan. The family that she lives with is really just using her, and they're no good. So she's trying to escape that family and her town and pretty much leave that life behind and have a life that's worth living, essentially. So she ends up taking the Kaju, which is this very prestigious test, and no one expects her to pass because even the rich kids aren't passing. But of course she does. So that's the very beginning of the book, and then that allows her to get into this elite military academy, and she's so excited to go there. She thinks that her world is changing, and then when she gets there, she realizes that no one wants her there,
the other kids, her classmates, are horrible to her, and she really just doesn't belong because she's a dark-skinned poor girl, and they all think that she cheated to get there. So she is not worthy of studying there. And this even translates to some of her professors and things like that. She struggles pretty much the whole time, and that's like the first part of the book is the school setting. And then in the second part of the book is the war setting. So in the book, there's been 2 poppy wars previously, and they're on the brink of the 3rd one. We know that the whole time, and in the second half of the book, it definitely switches to a war setting, following these same characters who are now surrounded by war. Like their petty school drama doesn't matter anymore because their lives are on the line. So seeing like the different character arcs and the growth that happens was phenomenal, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. I think that the platonic relationships in this book are amazing and definitely my favorite part of it. I loved Rin as the main character. You can see her definitely slipping into like a darker version of herself from the beginning. She has a long character journey, and she's definitely a flawed character as well, but I think that's what makes her so interesting. The magic system in this book is based on shamanism, which is also really cool. And the major idea or theme within this novel is what is the cost of war? Rin is a strong, fierce warrior, and she definitely doesn't start off that way, but I was rooting for her the whole time. There are choices that she has to make because it's wartime, and some of the choices are very morally gray. But with that, it's still a choice that has to be made, right? So that was just really interesting to see that character work. There's definitely action within the war setting and all of that stuff, but the fact that we got to know the characters and everything so well was definitely my favorite aspect of the story. So obviously I had to give it 5 stars, and I have not stopped thinking about it and cannot wait until I have time to read the next one. The last book I'm going to talk about is Middlegame by Seanan McGuire. This book is epic. Okay, this is a sci-fi fantasy adult novel, and it's really weird. Basically, I didn't know anything before going into this book. I had just been told that it was weird, but it was awesome, and they weren't lying. I felt that 100%. So as I said, I read this via audiobook. I thought the audiobook was fantastic. It was difficult though to read this book via audiobook just because of like the complexity of the book. Like there's multiple timelines going, and they keep jumping through time because there's time travel in the book, and then there is like a book within the book. So that got a little bit confusing, but not in the sense of like I always knew what was happening, but I always kind of had to get like resettled in the world when I like was reading it. It definitely helps that I like binge read this audiobook and listened to it for like long hours at a time. So that definitely made it easier to follow, but I definitely plan on rereading this book and picking up a physical copy just because that's still like my preferred way of reading. I love audiobooks, I'm obsessed with them, but I like physical pages. I'm a nerd. So like I said, there's time travel, alchemy, evil science doctor guy, all of that. This story follows twins Roger and Dodger. So Roger, he's skilled with language, and Dodger, she's skilled with numbers, so she's like a math wizard. And they're not aware that they're twins. They don't even know that the other truly exists. They live on opposite sides of the country, and they can communicate in their mind. So they kind of think they're each other's imaginary friends. The story starts off when they're 7, and it goes through to when they're in like their mid to late 20s. So definitely a character-driven story. We definitely get to know Roger and Dodger very well, and that was my favorite aspect of the story by far. Obviously, a whole bunch of weird stuff happens. The whole premise of the story is weird. They're like gods, but they're not gods. Or they're like ascending to godhood, but they have no idea because they're 7. We're aware of all of this because we get to follow one of like the doctors, their creator. We get to follow his perspective, so that's how we get to learn all of this. But then Roger and Dodger are also learning things as the story progresses. And then there's other characters that come into play as well, and basically everybody's really morally gray and we don't know who to trust. So I would say that it probably starts off slow. I don't think it starts off slow because I love character stuff, development. So I enjoy those slow parts. But when it picks up, it picks up. Like you're wondering what was going on, and then all of a sudden everything happens. So that's why I say it's just an epic book. I can't really explain it because it would just give everything away. So go ahead and read it. Be aware before going in that there are trigger warnings. There's an attempted suicide in the book. So trigger warnings for self-harm, as well as just there's some like gruesome violence in the book as well. It's an adult book for a reason. But Seanan McGuire's writing is just exquisite. I absolutely love it. I have not stopped thinking of this book since I put it down, and I read it over like almost 2 months ago at this point. It was phenomenal. Everyone should read it. I wish I had a better way of like summarizing it, but just read the book, okay? Okay. Alright, so those were all the books that I read in August and September, -1. I hope you all enjoyed it. Let me know down below what books you're currently reading. Let me know if you like this format of videos or what have you. If you made it this far, go ahead and leave a heart emoji. You can pick the color in the comment below. Thanks for watching. See you next time.